The porch swing was already hanging by the time anyone in Caldwell, Kansas had the nerve to ask Aaron Keene why he built it. It was the summer of 1878, and the prairie heat pressed down on everything like a flat iron on wet linen. The town of Caldwell sat close to the Kansas Indian Territory border, a place where cattle drives came through like rivers of dust and noise, where cowboys were rough-edged and sunburned, where women kept their eyes low and their voices steady because the world out here demanded both. It was a place of transience and grit, where most things were built out of necessity, not hope. And yet there sat Aaron Keene's porch swing, hanging from the beams of his newly completed front porch, 2 good lengths of rope, a wide plank of sanded oak, chains he had ordered from a catalog, all of it swaying gently in the dry Kansas wind, and not a soul in the world to sit on it beside him. Aaron Keene was 29 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had been working hard ground since he was tall enough to hold a shovel. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that ran through the bluffs east of town, and eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy afternoon, not quite gray, not quite green, something in between that changed depending on the light. He had come to Caldwell 3 years prior with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and a letter of deed to 40 acres his uncle had left him. He had turned those 40 acres into something worth looking at, a house with 2 rooms that had grown into 4. A barn painted red because he liked red, a garden his mother would have approved of, and now a porch swing. His neighbor, old Clive Barrow, who ran the feed and grain store on the main street, had raised an eyebrow when he spotted it one morning from the road. "Who's that for Keene?" Clive called out from his wagon. Aaron was standing back, examining the hang of the thing, making sure both sides were level. He glanced over his shoulder. "Nobody particular," he said. Clive scratched his chin. "You got nobody to sit on it with you?" "Not yet," Aaron said, and that was the end of that particular conversation, at least with Clive. The truth was simpler and more complicated than anything Aaron could have explained to Clive Barrow. Aaron had built the porch swing because he believed in the idea of a person before he had found the actual person. He believed that if a man built the life carefully enough, the right things would come to fill it. He had built the barn before he had cattle. He had planted the garden before he had anyone to cook for. He had sewn curtains for the bedroom window before there was anyone to share that bedroom. It was not foolishness. It was faith of a particular and quiet variety. And as it turned out, faith sometimes arrives on a stagecoach. Ruth Harper came to Caldwell on a Wednesday morning in early September of 1878, and she arrived with 1 trunk, 1 carpetbag, a letter of employment from the Caldwell School Board, and the expression of a woman who had already made peace with whatever hardship waited for her. She was 26 years old, slim and dark-haired, with brown eyes that were quick and intelligent and missed very little. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, both of whom had died within a year of each other when Ruth was 23, leaving her with grief and a good education and not much else. She had taught school in Jefferson City for 2 years after that, living in a boarding house, saving every cent she could. When the position in Caldwell had come across her desk through a letter from a cousin who had moved west, she had sat with it for 3 days before deciding. Kansas was not Missouri. Caldwell was not Jefferson City. But Ruth Harper had learned early that grief either hollows a person out or fills them with a peculiar kind of courage, and she had chosen, deliberately, courage. She stepped off the stagecoach into the bright Kansas morning and looked around at the main street of Caldwell, at the saloon and the general store, and the church steeple visible over a row of cottonwood trees, at the dust rising from the cattle pens at the far end of town, at the cowboys moving along the boardwalk in their worn boots and trail-stained hats. She adjusted the carpetbag on her arm, straightened her back, and walked directly toward the building marked Caldwell School Board and Administrative Office, as though she had been here 100 times before. The school was a 1-room building on the east edge of town, painted white, with 6 rows of desks and a chalkboard that needed replacing. The chairman of the school board was a portly man named Howard Finch who shook her hand with excessive enthusiasm and introduced her to what he called the finest little schoolroom in all of southern Kansas, which Ruth privately thought was not a high bar, but she smiled graciously and asked sensible questions about enrollment and curricula and the condition of the textbook supply. She was given lodging at the Caldwell boarding house run by a woman named Mabel Greer, who was stout and no-nonsense, and made the best biscuits Ruth had ever tasted. Mabel showed her to a clean room on the second floor with a window overlooking the street, and Ruth stood at that window for a long moment, looking out at the wide Kansas sky, which was in truth one of the most extraordinary things she had ever seen, enormous and blue and completely without apology, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. She met Aaron Keene on her 4th day in Caldwell. It was not a dramatic meeting. It was not the kind of encounter that gets written about in dime novels. No runaway horse, no rescue, no collision around a corner that sends papers flying everywhere. It was simply this. Ruth had gone to the general store to purchase chalk and a ruler and a small pot of ink, and Aaron Keene was there buying nails and a length of rope and arguing pleasantly with the proprietor, a thin man named George Aldies, about whether the new batch of rope was as good as the last. "The twist is different," Aaron was saying, turning the rope over in his hands with the focused attention of a man who understood materials. "The last batch had a tighter twist. This one will fray faster." George Aldies sighed. "Same supplier, Keene. You are the only man in Caldwell who can detect a difference in rope twist." "That doesn't mean the difference isn't there," Aaron said mildly. Ruth had reached the counter beside him to set down her items, and without looking up from the rope, Aaron stepped sideways to give her more space, which she noticed because most men in her experience required a direct indication before they thought to move. She set down her chalk and her ruler and her ink pot and waited for George to attend to her. Aaron glanced over at the items on the counter and then up at her face. He had a direct way of looking at a person, not rude but fully present, as though he genuinely intended to see who he was looking at. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said. "Word travels fast in a town this size." "I gathered it might," Ruth said. "Ruth Harper." "Aaron Keene." He held out his hand and she shook it, which she did without hesitation because Ruth Harper was not in the habit of treating a handshake as anything other than a handshake. His hand was warm and calloused and entirely steady. "You have a farm?" she asked, because the nails and the rope indicated as much. 40 acres south of town," he said. "Came up from nothing 3 years ago. I'm not unhappy with where it's gotten to." "That's a good way to feel about something you've built," she said. He looked at her for a moment as though she had said something more interesting than she had intended, and then he smiled, and the smile did something quite specific to the quality of the afternoon light, or at least that was how Ruth would remember it later, when she was back in her room at Mabel's and staring at the ceiling. He paid for his rope and his nails. She paid for her chalk and ruler and ink. He held the door open for her when they both turned to leave at the same moment, and outside on the boardwalk they walked in the same direction for half a block before he tipped his hat and turned down a side street, and she continued on toward the schoolhouse. She thought about him for the rest of the afternoon, and then felt unreasonably annoyed with herself for doing so. The first weeks of September were busy enough that she had limited time for thoughts about Aaron Keene or anyone else. The school had 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were a varied collection of personalities, from the earnest and hardworking to the resistant and the restless. Ruth was good at her work because she genuinely liked children, and because she had an instinct for finding what made each individual student pay attention. Within 10 days, she had them all settled into a routine, and she had written to the school board requesting new reading primers and an updated geography map, which Howard Finch approved with the same excessive enthusiasm he brought to everything. She settled into Caldwell the way a person settles into a new coat, gradually, noticing what fit and what needed adjusting. She liked Mabel Greer very much and enjoyed their evening conversations over supper. She was less fond of the particular quality of Kansas dust, which seemed to find its way into every room regardless of how tightly the windows were shut. She appreciated the church, though the minister, Reverend Talbot, had a tendency towards sermons that ran long. She appreciated Caldwell's doctor, a capable young man named Felix Drummond who had come up from Texas and who ran the town's modest infirmary with quiet competence. What she had not anticipated was that a town this size would provide so few opportunities for the kind of solitude she was accustomed to seeking when she needed to think. Missouri had woods she could walk into. Caldwell had open prairie in every direction, which was beautiful in a way that felt enormous and slightly vertiginous, like standing on the edge of something without a railing. She took to walking south along the road in the late afternoons, once school was finished, because the road south led away from the noise of the cattle pens and the saloon and toward quieter territory. It was on one of these walks, about 3 weeks after her arrival, that she first saw Aaron Keene's property. She had not known it was his until she stopped at a low fence and looked up the gentle rise toward the house, which was solidly built and well-maintained, with a red barn visible behind it and a garden that ran along the south side, still green despite the September heat. And on the front porch, hanging from the beams by 2 good lengths of rope, was a porch swing. It was empty. She stood at the fence looking at it for a long moment, her head tilted slightly to one side the way it did when she encountered something that made her think. It was a well-made thing, the swing wide enough for 2 people, the planks sanded smooth. And there was something about it, sitting there empty in the afternoon light with the whole empty prairie spread out behind the house, that she could not quite name. She had not noticed anyone watching until Aaron Keene appeared from the side of the house with a bucket in one hand, apparently headed toward the garden. He stopped when he saw her at the fence. "Miss Harper," he said, not surprised, just acknowledging. "Mr. Keene," she said. "I'm sorry, I was just walking and I stopped without thinking. I wasn't trying to be rude." "You weren't being rude," he said. He set the bucket down and came to the fence, stopping a respectful distance on his side of it. "It's a public road. You're welcome to look." She looked back at the swing. "Who is that for?" she asked, and then was immediately embarrassed because it was an extremely personal question to ask a man she barely knew. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." But he didn't seem bothered by it. He turned and looked at the swing himself for a moment, as though considering it fresh. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he said. "I built it because I felt the porch needed one." "Before you had anyone to sit on it with you," she said, half to herself, because it was what she was thinking. "Yes," he said. He looked at her then, and there was that quality in his attention again, that full, quiet presence. "Would you like to sit on it?" She should have said no. She was, after all, a schoolteacher in a small town where every action had social weight, and sitting on a porch swing with a bachelor farmer was the kind of thing Mabel Greer would have strong opinions about. But the swing was beautiful and the afternoon was long, and Ruth Harper had chosen courage over caution, so she said, "Yes, I think I would." He opened the fence gate and she walked up the gentle rise to the porch, and he brought her a glass of water without being asked, because it was warm and she had been walking, and they sat on the porch swing together and it swayed gently, and the prairie stretched out in front of them in the long gold light of a September afternoon. They talked. It surprised her how easily they talked, because Ruth was not a woman given to easy conversation with people she didn't know well. She was warm with children and professional with adults, and she had a few close friendships built over years of trust, but she was not the kind of person who opened quickly. With Aaron, it was different. He asked questions the way he looked at things, directly and with genuine interest, and he listened to the answers with his whole attention, not just waiting for his turn to speak. She told him about Missouri and about her parents, and about the 2 years teaching in Jefferson City. He told her about his uncle, who had been a strange and solitary man but a fair one, and about the first winter on the 40 acres, which had been brutal and which he had survived largely through stubbornness and the goodwill of old Clive Barrow, who had extended him credit at the grain store without being asked. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After that first winter, why didn't you go back?" "I had already built the barn," he said simply, and she understood that deeply and exactly. The sun moved lower and the air cooled, and eventually Ruth said she ought to get back before Mabel worried, and Aaron walked her to the fence and thanked her for the company in a tone that suggested he meant it without excess. She walked back to town with the particular sensation of having met someone who felt already familiar, which was a sensation she had not had before and did not know quite what to do with. Over the following weeks, she returned to the fence 3 more times without planning to, and each time Aaron came out of wherever he was and they sat on the porch swing and talked. The conversations grew in depth the way rivers grow in a wet season, gradually and with increasing current. She learned that he read widely, ordering books from a catalog the way other men ordered equipment, and that he had strong opinions about irrigation and weather patterns and very gentle opinions about most everything else. He learned that she had a sharp memory for detail and a sense of humor that emerged sideways, unexpected, and that she was more homesick for her parents than she had admitted to anyone in Caldwell. In October, Caldwell had its annual harvest social, held in the church hall and attended by nearly every person in town. Mabel Greer insisted Ruth must attend, and also insisted on lending her a blue ribbon for her hair, which Ruth accepted because Mabel's expressions of care were best received without argument. The hall was warm and loud and smelled of apple cider and wood smoke, and there was a fiddle player named Tom Greer, Mabel's nephew, who was excellent, and couples danced on the cleared floor with the contained enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for an excuse. Aaron was there. He was standing with Clive Barrow near the cider table, both of them with their hats off the way men take their hats off inside, and when he saw Ruth come in, he raised his chin in acknowledgement and she raised hers back, which Mabel noticed immediately. "You know Aaron Keene," Mabel said, with a tone that was more observation than question. "We've met," Ruth said. "He's a good man," Mabel said, with the particular emphasis of a woman who wants to make a point without making a speech. Tom Greer was playing a reel and the floor was full, and when Aaron crossed the room to where Ruth stood and asked if she would dance, she said yes, and they danced, and she discovered that he was a better dancer than she had expected, not formal but sure-footed, and he held her with the careful respect of a man who understood the difference between what was permitted and what was wanted. They danced twice, which was already territory that required no announcement to be noticed, and then they sat together in 2 chairs along the wall and talked until the fiddle music slowed, and people began finding their coats, and he walked her back to Mabel's boarding house through the cool October dark. On the porch of the boarding house he stood with his hat in his hands and said, "I've enjoyed your company very much, Miss Harper." "Ruth," she said, "please." "Ruth," he said, and he looked at her in the lamplight with that quiet full attention, and she felt the sentence she was composed of rearranged slightly. "I've enjoyed your company very much." "So have I," she said. "Yours." He put his hat back on and said good night, and she went inside, and Mabel was still awake because of course she was, sitting by the stove with a cup of tea and an expression of serene innocence that Ruth did not believe for a moment. "Not a word," Ruth said. "I didn't say anything," Mabel said, and smiled into her teacup. November came in hard and cold, the way Kansas Novembers do, with a wind off the prairie that found every gap in every wall and made the world feel like a lesson in endurance. Ruth put extra blankets on her students' laps during lessons and sent the younger ones home early when the temperature dropped past a certain point. She had written to the school board again about the condition of the stove in the schoolroom, which was old and temperamental, and this time Howard Finch had actually responded by producing a new stove within 2 weeks, which she suspected had more to do with the influence of several mothers on the school board than with her letter alone, but she was grateful regardless. Aaron brought firewood to the schoolhouse one November morning without being asked. A generous load he stacked neatly along the east wall, and when she came out to thank him, he shook his head as though it were nothing. "The new stove will draw better if you stack it this way," he said, and showed her practically and without condescension, and she appreciated that he had not asked if she wanted help, just provided it, and that he had not made a production of it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him standing there in the cold November morning with his breath making small clouds, and his coat collar turned up in his eyes that creekwater color, and she thought, "I am in very serious trouble." That evening she wrote in her journal, which she had kept since she was 16, "I believe I am forming an attachment of a significant variety. I'm not certain what to do about it. He is kind and honest and intelligent, and he thinks about things deeply, and he built a porch swing before he had anyone to sit on it because he believed in what was possible, and I find that I cannot stop thinking about it." She had not said anything about her feelings to him, and he had not said anything explicit to her, but there was something building between them the way weather builds, slowly and then all at once. They were together often enough now that it had become a pattern. Walks on Sunday afternoons, conversations on the porch swing on days when the weather permitted, and a growing ease in each other's company that was different from the politeness of new acquaintance, warmer and more particular. In late November, 3 things happened that changed the pace of what was building between them. The first was that a cattle drive came through Caldwell, late in the season and loud about it. About 200 head from Texas moving north, and the cowboys who came with it were the trail-worn, rough-edged kind that always made a cattle town tense for a few days. Most of them were orderly enough, tired men who wanted a meal and a bed more than trouble, but there were 2 among them who were not. Ruth had been walking back from the schoolhouse on the first evening the drive was in town when 2 cowboys, already into their whiskey, though it was barely past sundown, stopped her on the boardwalk and made remarks that were the kind of remarks that women in the West had been enduring since the first settlements, crude and presumptuous, delivered with the particular confidence of men who expected no consequence. Ruth had faced situations like this before, and she knew her options. She straightened to her full height, which was not considerable but which she deployed with precision, and said in her clearest schoolteacher voice, "I suggest you move on." One of them laughed and stepped toward her, and then Aaron Keene was there, having come out of the hardware store 3 doors down, and he positioned himself between Ruth and the 2 cowboys with a calm that was somehow more authoritative than anger would have been. "Evening," he said to the cowboys pleasantly. "She asked you to move on." He was not a man who made threats or speeches. He simply stood there, steady as a fence post, looking at them with an equanimity that made it very clear to both men that he had no intention of moving and every intention of standing exactly where he was for as long as required. There was a long moment of the particular tension that occurs when one person's stillness puts the lie to another person's bluster, and then the 2 cowboys made some noise under their breath and moved along. Aaron turned to Ruth. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was mostly, though her hands were clenched at her sides in a way she was working to unclench. "Thank you, I was handling it." "You were," he said. "I just thought another person might be useful." She looked at him. He was not being falsely modest or performing heroism. He had simply described what he had done accurately, she thought. This is the kind of man who helps without making you feel small for needing the help. "It was useful," she said. "Thank you, Aaron." He walked her back to Mabel's that evening, and when she thanked him again at the porch he said, with the careful tone of a man who has been thinking about something for some time, "Ruth, I would very much like if you were willing to consider something more formal. I mean to say I would like to court you, properly, if you would have that." The prairie wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the street, and the lamplight from the boarding house window fell across the porch boards, and Ruth Harper stood in the cool November dark and felt the thing that had been building in her chest open fully, like a door that had been stuck and finally gives. "Yes," she said, "I would have that." He nodded, and the quality of his expression was not triumphant, just grateful in the quiet and genuine way of a man who does not take good things for granted. He said good night and put his hat on and walked back down the street, and Ruth went inside. Mabel was waiting by the stove again. "Well," she said. "Still not a word, Mabel," Ruth said, but she was smiling so broadly that it entirely undermined her position. Mabel laughed and handed her a cup of tea. The second thing that happened in late November was that a letter arrived from Ruth's cousin Lydia in St. Louis, and it contained news that Lydia's husband had found work in California, and they were moving in the spring, and would Ruth consider coming too? There was a good school in Sacramento, and the weather was mild, and Ruth would not have to spend another Kansas winter alone. Ruth read the letter twice and set it on her desk, and did not answer it for 2 days, during which time she thought about Sacramento and mild weather and Lydia, who was the closest thing to family she had left, and she also thought about 40 acres south of town, and a porch swing built for someone not yet arrived, and a man with creekwater eyes who had asked to court her with the same directness and sincerity he brought to everything. She wrote back to Lydia at the end of the second day. She said she was grateful and she loved her, and she was going to stay in Caldwell. The third thing that happened was a blizzard. It came in from the northwest on the last Saturday of November with no particular warning, the way blizzards come on the Kansas plains, fast and total, and without apology. Ruth was at Aaron's farm when it arrived. She had come for Sunday dinner, which Mabel had approved of because Mabel had known Aaron Keene for 3 years and considered him trustworthy, and they had been eating and talking, and she had been helping him clear the dishes when the light through the window changed in that particular way that prairie people learn to read. Aaron looked out the window and said, "We're not going anywhere for a while." The blizzard lasted through the night and into Sunday morning, and Ruth spent the night at Aaron's farm, which was entirely unchaperoned, and which would give Mabel something to manage in terms of what she said to whom, but which was also simply what a blizzard required. Aaron gave her his bedroom and slept in the front room beside the stove, and she found this so matter-of-fact and decent that she lay in his bed, listening to the wind howling across the prairie, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets. In the morning the blizzard had passed, and everything was white and clean and enormous. Aaron made coffee and eggs and biscuits, and they sat at his kitchen table in the early morning stillness that follows a storm, and the quality of the light through the snow-covered windows was like being inside a lantern, soft and contained and warm. She had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and he had his forearms resting on the table, and outside the snow was piling against the red barn, and the porch swing had a ridge of white along its plank. She told him about Lydia's letter. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which was characteristic of him. When she finished, he said, "What did you write back?" "That I was staying," she said. Looked at her with those creekwater eyes. "Because of the school?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "I'm glad," he said. "Ruth, I want you to know that whatever you chose, I would have understood. I don't want to be a reason someone stays somewhere against their better judgment." "You're not," she said. "You're a reason I stay because it's the right thing. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. Outside, a bird landed on the porch railing, shook the snow off its wings, and flew on. "My father used to say," Ruth continued, setting down her coffee cup, "that a place isn't home because of where it is. It's home because of who's in it." Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," she said. "I miss him very much." There was a depth of understanding in the way he received that made her eyes sting, not with grief exactly, but with the particular feeling of being truly known. She blinked it back and picked up her coffee cup again, and they sat in companionable silence while the snow settled outside and the stove ticked and the morning grew fully light. He brought her back to Mabel's in the wagon when the road was passable, and Mabel came out onto the boarding house porch with an expression that was 3 parts relief and 1 part theatrical concern. Ruth explained the blizzard, which Mabel already knew about perfectly well, having been inside it herself. Mabel studied Aaron's face and then Ruth's face and said, "Come in and have coffee," to both of them, and that was that. Courting in Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 had its own particular rhythm, which was shaped by the conventions of the time and the visibility of small-town life and the practical realities of two working people. Aaron came to the boarding house on Thursday evenings for dinner, which Mabel served, and at which several of Mabel's other boarders were also present, which satisfied the proprieties adequately. Ruth came to the farm on Sunday afternoons when the weather was decent, and they rode together sometimes in his wagon, and he came to church on Sundays and sat 3 pews behind her because that was where he had always sat, and she thought it would be presumptuous to assume he ought to change his pew just because they were courting. But he moved to her pew on the 3rd Sunday without being asked, and she noticed. They argued sometimes. Not badly, not with cruelty, but with the honest friction of two people who had formed their opinions independently and were not willing to abandon them without a reason. They argued about the best way to organize the school library, which Aaron had volunteered to help rearrange one Saturday, and about whether Reverend Talbot's last sermon had been too political or appropriately so, and about the new town ordinance on cattle drives through the main street, which Aaron thought was necessary, and Ruth thought was too restrictive without a consultation with the ranchers. And these arguments were conducted with the kind of mutual respect that meant neither of them felt they had to win, they just had to be heard. December brought Christmas, and with it, a particular kind of quiet beauty to the prairie that Ruth had not anticipated. The snow lay across the flatland in long, smooth shapes, and the sky at sunset turned colors that she had no words for, pink shading into amber shading into a violet that was almost purple, and the air was so cold and clear that the stars at night were extraordinary, more stars than she had ever seen in Missouri, the whole sky packed with them. Aaron had a Christmas tradition of making a basket for each of 3 homesteading families south of town that were poorer than the general run of Caldwell's population, families who had come to the territory with hope and found the first years punishing. He did this quietly, loading the wagon before dawn and driving out and leaving the baskets on porches without waiting for thanks. Ruth found out about it from Clive Barrow, who mentioned it in passing while she was in the feed store. She did not say anything to Aaron about knowing, but she baked an extra apple pie and had it ready when he came on Christmas morning with his wagon already loaded. And when he pulled up, she climbed up onto the wagon seat with the pie, and he looked at her, and then at the pie. "Clive Barrow," she said, he sighed. "Clive can't keep a thing to himself." "He can't," she agreed cheerfully. "Where are we going first?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression that rearranged things, and then he picked up the reins. "The Colemans," he said. "South Fork Road, about 4 miles. The Coleman family had 3 children and a father who had broken his leg in the fall, and a mother who had the particular quiet dignity of a woman managing an impossible situation. She came to the door when the wagon pulled up, and Aaron said, "Good morning, ma'am," and set the basket down, and Ruth held out the apple pie, and the woman looked at both of them for a moment with an expression that Ruth would carry with her for the rest of her life, which was made of exhaustion and gratitude, and the kind of pride that does not forbid receiving what is genuinely needed. "Merry Christmas," Ruth said. "God bless you both," the woman said, and took the pie. On the drive back to town, through the cold Christmas morning with the snow bright on either side of the road, and the horses blowing steam and the sky very blue, Aaron said, "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for letting me," she said. He transferred the reins to one hand, and with the other he took her gloved hand in his and held it, and she laced her fingers through his, and they drove back to Caldwell in the Christmas cold with their hands joined, and the wide plain stretching out in every direction like a blank page on which anything might still be written. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in early February of 1879. He did not make a production of it. They had been sitting on the porch swing in the weak winter sunlight, which was just barely warm enough to be outside if you had a coat on, and they had been talking about the spring planting and about a book they were both reading, different books but by the same author, and there had been a natural pause in the conversation. And in that pause Aaron said, "Ruth, I would like to marry you. I know that's not a small question, and I know you came to Kansas to build your own life, and I don't want to ask you to fold your life into mine. I want to build one together if you're willing." She turned her head and looked at him. The porch swing moved gently in the February air. Behind the house the prairie spread out, bare and still and enormous. "Aaron," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said, and then laughed because they had said the same word to different things, and he laughed too, and it was the kind of laughter that comes from the deepest part of being alive. And she reached across and took his face in her gloved hands and kissed him for the first time, there on the porch swing in the cold February afternoon. And it was warm and true, and exactly what she had been moving toward since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach in September. He put his hands over hers where they were still cupping his face, and they sat like that for a long moment, the swing barely moving, the prairie impossibly wide around them. And he said against her mouth very quietly, "I built the swing before I knew who I was building it for." "I know," she said. "I think I was building it for you," he said. "I think you were too," she said. Mabel Greer, when informed that evening, did something Ruth had never seen her do, which was cry. She cried quickly and wiped her face with her apron and then said, "Well, of course you are," and produced a bottle of good brandy from a cabinet that Ruth had not known existed. She poured 3 glasses and raised hers and said, "To Aaron Keene, who is exactly the right sort of man, and to Ruth Harper, who was exactly right for this town whether she knew it yet or not." They drank. The wedding was held in Caldwell's church on the 15th of March, 1879, because March was when the weather was uncertain enough to be interesting and warm enough to be tolerable, and that felt right to Ruth somehow, beginning something new at the precise moment when the land was beginning again. Reverend Talbot kept the sermon to a reasonable length, which Ruth suspected Aaron had negotiated somehow, and the whole town came, which is what happens in small towns when two people who are widely liked decide to be together. Tom Greer played the fiddle. Mabel had made a cake with dried apple filling because fresh fruit was not to be had in March in Kansas, and it was the best cake Ruth had ever eaten. Clive Barrow shook Aaron's hand for a very long time and said something gruff that made Aaron nod seriously. Felix Drummond, the doctor, danced with Ruth during the celebration after, which was held in the church hall because it was still too cold outside, and told her she had made an excellent choice, to which she said she thought so too. And when Aaron and Ruth drove home together to the farm in the March evening, with the stars coming out and the prairie going dark around them and the last of the winter cold in the air, Ruth looked ahead to where the farmhouse was visible against the darkening sky, the red barn behind it and the garden bed still bare and the porch, with the swing hanging from its beams. She had been in Caldwell for 6 months. She had come with 1 trunk and 1 carpet-bag, and a letter of employment and a particular quality of courage. She had built a life here in the way she did everything, carefully and deliberately, and now she was driving home with a man who understood the difference between building a life and waiting for one, who had planted a garden before there was anyone to cook for and sewed curtains before there was anyone to draw them, and built a porch swing before there was anyone to sit on it beside him. They went inside and lit the lamps, and the house was warm from the banked stove, and Aaron put the kettle on for tea, and Ruth walked through the 4 rooms of the house, not for the first time because she had been here many times, but for the first time as the person who lived in it, touching the curtain at the bedroom window that he had made himself, and looking at the books stacked on the shelf by the fireplace, and the kitchen table worn smooth from years of use. When she came back to the kitchen, he handed her a cup of tea and she leaned against the counter and looked at him across the warm room and thought, "I chose courage and it brought me here." Spring came to the Kansas plain in the way of something that has been waiting a long time and is now done waiting, fast and then all at once, the green coming up through the brown and the meadowlarks returning to the fence posts, and the sky going that brilliant April blue that is different from every other blue in every other season. Aaron planted the garden and Ruth helped, and they disagreed about the spacing of the bean rows in a way that was resolved by a compromise that turned out to be better than either original plan. She continued teaching. She had discussed this with Aaron before the wedding, plainly and directly, because she was not willing to give it up and she needed to know if that was something he could live with, a wife who worked, whose work took her from the house 5 days a week, and whose attention was genuinely divided between the farm and the school. He had said, without hesitation, that her work was part of who she was and he had not asked to marry part of her. The school grew that spring. 3 new families had come to the territory over the winter, drawn by the possibility of land, and they had children with them, which increased Ruth's enrollment to 30, which required a second stove and a new row of desks, which she petitioned the school board for and received after only 1 meeting. She liked the work in a way that fed her from somewhere deep, the particular satisfaction of watching a child move from confusion to understanding, of finding the right way to explain something that had seemed impossible, of being the person in a room whose job was to make things clear. Aaron expanded the farm that spring, adding a second field and negotiating with a rancher 3 miles east for the use of 2 good draft horses for the plowing season. He was methodical about everything and the farm responded to his care by producing reliably, and by the summer of 1879, he had a solid crop of winter wheat coming in and good yields from the garden, and a pen of chickens that Ruth had suggested, and he had agreed to with the patient willingness of a man who had no strong opinion about chickens but trusted his wife's instincts. Ruth had been right about the chickens. They were productive and low maintenance, and the eggs supplemented the household income in a modest way that added up over time. They had been married 4 months when Ruth was certain enough to tell Aaron, on a Sunday evening in July, that they were going to have a child. He went very still in the way he did when something mattered completely. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, gently, the way you hold something important, and looked at her. "You're certain," he said. "Dr. Drummond confirmed it yesterday," she said. "March, he thinks, the end of March." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see everything moving through him, the weight and the wonder of it, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. He pulled her close and held her with his arms around her and his face against her hair, and she felt him breathe and felt his arms, steady and warm, and she closed her eyes. "A porch swing and a house with 4 rooms and a garden and chickens," she said against his shoulder. "And now this." "And now this," he said. She felt him smile. The summer of 1879 moved through its long hot days with the particular beauty of a Kansas summer when the wheat is growing, and the evenings are cooled by the breeze off the plain, and the whole world has a kind of golden patience. Ruth taught school through October, until the walk and the days on her feet became difficult enough that she handed the class to a temporary teacher, a capable young woman named Clara Timms, who boarded with Mabel and who had a teaching certificate from Ohio, and who Ruth spent 3 weeks preparing so thoroughly that Clara laughed and said, "Miss Harper, or Mrs. Keene, they are in good hands." Aaron built a cradle. He built it the same way he built everything, carefully and with attention to the materials, selecting the wood and sanding it smooth and joining it so it would last decades. He put a carved detail on the headboard, not elaborate, just a simple leaf pattern, because his hands were capable of that kind of careful work when they had time. Ruth watched him working on it in the evenings by lamplight and felt the warmth of the thing spreading through her. This cradle built before the baby had arrived, for a person not yet named, in a house that had been built for a life not yet fully realized, and it seemed to her that this was simply how Aaron Keene moved through the world, building toward the possible, believing in what was coming. The baby came on the 28th of March, 1880, a year and 13 days after their wedding. It was a boy. Dr. Drummond came out to the farm, and Mabel came too, because Mabel was the kind of person who arrived where she was needed without being sent for. The labor was long and hard in the way that first labors often are, and Aaron sat outside the bedroom door for 5 hours with his hands clasped and his jaw set, and the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to managing difficulty, and is finding this particular difficulty operates outside his management entirely. When Felix Drummond opened the door and said, "You have a son, Aaron, and your wife is fine," Aaron closed his eyes for one long moment and then stood and went in. Ruth was tired and her hair was damp, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. She had the baby in her arms, wrapped in the flannel blanket Mabel had brought, and the baby was red and squinting, and Aaron sat beside the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife and said nothing at all for a long while because there was nothing to say that would have been large enough. "Samuel," Ruth said. "I'd like to call him Samuel, after my father." "Samuel," Aaron said. He put out one finger, and the baby's hand closed around it reflexively, with that extraordinary grip of the newly arrived. "Hello, Samuel." Mabel had produced food from somewhere in the way Mabel always produced food, and she brought it in and then took herself and Felix Drummond back to the kitchen to give the family their first quiet hour together. And the three of them, Aaron and Ruth and Samuel Keene, were in the lamplight of the bedroom that Aaron had sewn curtains for before there was anyone to draw them, and the prairie was dark outside, and the stars were out, and the porch swing was still hanging from the beams on the front porch. Still there, Samuel was a healthy and demanding infant who arrived into the world with decided opinions about his needs, all of which he communicated at considerable volume. Aaron, who had managed 40 acres and blizzards and difficult horses with equanimity, discovered that an 8-pound human being with strong lungs could reduce him to a state of helpless devotion that was entirely outside his previous experience. He walked the baby in the early mornings when Samuel was restless, moving in slow circles in the kitchen while Ruth slept, and he talked to him in a low voice about the farm and the spring planting and the prairie and what the weather was doing. And Ruth, who was not always actually asleep during these conversations, heard them and loved them. Ruth returned to teaching in September of 1880 when Samuel was 5 months old. Mabel took the baby during school hours, which Mabel had proposed herself, and which Ruth had accepted after 2 days of internal debate about whether it was the right thing. It was unambiguously the right thing. Mabel loved Samuel with the energy of a woman who had not had children of her own, and Samuel thrived under this additional affection, and Ruth returned to her classroom with the particular focus of a person who has divided her heart between two things she loves, and found that the heart is capable of expanding rather than dividing. The year 1880 moved into 1881 and then into 1882, and the farm grew, and the school grew, and Caldwell grew with the steady, improbable persistence of a prairie town finding its feet. More families came to the territory, lured by the promise of land, the possibility that was still in those years, a real and working thing in the West, even as the old cattle drive routes were shifting, and the railroad was changing what a town like Caldwell could be. Aaron watched the railroad discussions with the attention of a man who understands that infrastructure shapes everything, and when the question of a Caldwell rail line came before the town in 1882, he was at every meeting, speaking clearly and practically about what it would mean for farmers and for the school, and for the long-term stability of the town. The rail line came in the end, as rail lines do. Ruth had the school expanded in 1882, a second room added on the east side, which required a second teacher, and she hired Clara Timms back from Ohio, where Clara had returned to visit family, and they made an excellent team, Ruth handling the older children and Clara the younger, and the school became something the town was genuinely proud of. Samuel turned 2 in March of 1882 and was already at 2, a person with his own clear character, which involved a great deal of curiosity about everything and a tendency to be found in places he had not been instructed to be. He had Aaron's directness and Ruth's precision with language, which meant that by 2.5 he was asking questions with a clarity and persistence that made adults both delighted and occasionally exhausted. He called the porch swing the swing seat, which was perfectly logical, and which made Ruth and Aaron smile every time he said it. He also, at 2.5, discovered the chicken pen, and developed a relationship with the chickens that was entirely one-sided on the chicken's part, but that Samuel pursued with great enthusiasm, and since it was benign and kept him occupied, his parents permitted it. In the fall of 1882, Ruth told Aaron she was expecting again. He received this news with the same quality of still, complete attention, and then the warmth moving through his face, and she thought, as she always thought when she watched him receive something important, here is a man who knows how to be present. He pulled her close and held her and said, Samuel is going to have to learn to be magnanimous. He will, she said. He's your son. He's yours too, Aaron said. He's got your vocabulary at an age when vocabulary is supposed to be limited. She laughed against his chest. Outside, the fall light was moving across the prairie in long golden strips, and the swing was turning slightly in the afternoon breeze, and Samuel was in the garden very specifically looking for something Aaron had told him not to look for, which was the toad that lived under the third row of bean plants. The second baby was a girl. She came in May of 1883, easier than Samuel had come, or at least faster, and she arrived into the world with considerably less vocal protest and a great deal more apparent serenity, which Dr. Drummond said meant nothing about character and everything about physiology, but which Ruth privately thought indicated something. They named her Clara, not after Clara Timms, but after Ruth's mother, whose name had also been Clara, which was a coincidence that pleased the other Clara considerably when she found out. Clara Keene had dark hair like Ruth and Aaron's creekwater eyes, and from very early on a particular stillness in her gaze that made you feel she was considering her position carefully before committing to anything. Samuel adored her with the overwhelming and slightly alarming love of a 3-year-old toward an infant, which required some management to prevent the adoration from becoming a problem, and Aaron was extraordinarily patient in the management of this, endlessly redirecting Samuel's enthusiasm toward gentler expressions without ever diminishing it. Summer of 1883. The farm was in full production. The school year had ended, and Ruth had 3 months with her children and her husband and the garden and the porch swing and the enormous Kansas sky. She had been in Caldwell for 5 years. She thought about this sometimes, about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in September of 1878 with 1 trunk and 1 carpetbag, and the expression of someone who had made peace with whatever waited. That woman had chosen courage and had found on the other side of courage something she had not known to hope for specifically, not happiness in the abstract but happiness in the specific and daily, in the smell of coffee in the morning and the sound of Aaron's voice reading to Samuel from the front room in the evenings, and the weight of Clara in her arms and the view from the porch swing across the prairie that changed with every hour of light. One late August afternoon in 1883, Ruth was sitting on the porch swing with Clara sleeping in her arms, watching Samuel chase something across the yard that she chose not to investigate too closely, when Aaron came from the barn and stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at her. He had been repairing a section of fencing, and he had flour sack smudges on his forearms, and his hat was pushed back on his head, and he looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that he was always completely himself. "You're smiling," he said. "I was thinking," she said. He came up the porch steps and sat beside her on the swing, settling it into motion. Clara shifted in her sleep and resettled. "About what?" he said. "About the swing," she said. "About when I first saw it." He was quiet, listening. "I was walking and I stopped at the fence," she said, "and I looked up the rise and saw the house and the barn and this swing, and it was empty. And I thought, who is that for? And then you asked me, he said. And you said you weren't entirely sure yet, she said. He reached over and took her free hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles in the slow, habitual way it did when they were sitting together and he was content. And then you smiled, she said. I was thinking about it, he said. About why I built it. Why did you? She asked. The same question she had asked all those years ago at the fence, but different now that she knew the answer, asking it not for information but for the pleasure of hearing it. He turned his head and looked at her. In the yard, Samuel had apparently caught whatever he was chasing and was regarding it with scientific interest. Clara breathed steadily in the afternoon warmth. The swing moved gently. Because I believed it would be used, Aaron said. Because I believed in what was coming before it came. She looked at him. 5 years of mornings and blizzards and harvest socials and arguments about bean row spacing and Christmas baskets, and a boy named Samuel and a girl named Clara and a porch swing swaying in the wind and a vast and indifferent and beautiful prairie. 5 years of choosing to be here and finding that here was everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder. You were right, she said. I know, he said, and she could hear the smile in it without looking. The fall of 1883 brought new families to the territory, and with them, new complications. A dispute arose between two neighboring homesteaders, a German family named the Hossers and an older settler named Pete Grady, over the precise boundary of a property line that had been informally agreed upon years before, and was now contested as the land became more valuable. The dispute escalated past neighborly disagreement into the territory of genuine conflict, and the sheriff, a steady man named Caldwell, was involved, and eventually a land surveyor was brought down from Wichita to settle it properly. Aaron was involved in mediating the early discussions between the Hossers and Pete Grady, because he was the kind of person people brought their disputes to when they wanted someone who would hear both sides. He spent 3 evenings in a row at various kitchen tables, listening to the competing claims and asking questions, and helping each party articulate what they actually needed rather than what they were demanding, which turned out to be somewhat different things. The surveyor confirmed the boundary and awarded the disputed 6-foot strip to the Hossers, which was correct and which Pete Grady ultimately accepted, because the process had been fair even if the outcome was not what he'd hoped. Ruth watched this process with the admiration she always felt when Aaron was at his best, which was this: the patient and intelligent management of human difficulty. She told him so one evening, and he said he had learned some of it from watching her teach, which she did not quite believe but appreciated. That winter, a hard one, Aaron added an enclosed porch to the front of the house, which meant the porch swing was now protected from the worst of the weather, and Ruth could sit on it in December if she wrapped herself in enough blankets, which she did with some frequency, because she had come to love the swing and what it represented and the view from it, even in winter, especially in winter, when the snow was on the plain and the sky was that particular winter gray that was somehow also clear. And the silence was complete enough that you could hear your own breathing. Samuel, at 3.5, had decided the swing was also his, and would climb up onto it and demand to be pushed, which Aaron did with great patience, and which Ruth did while reading, one hand on the rope at Samuel's back. Clara, at 7 months, watched the process from whatever blanket or arm was containing her with that particular considering expression she brought to everything. Christmas of 1883 was the same as Christmas of 1878 had been, and also entirely different. The basket still went to 3 families, 4 now because a 4th family had fallen on hard times. Ruth baked 2 pies. Samuel came with them on the wagon this year because he was old enough and because he had asked with the directness of a child who has been raised by direct parents, and he sat between Aaron and Ruth on the wagon seat and was told what they were doing and why, and he listened with his mother's precision and his father's seriousness, and when they left the last basket he said, "Is that what we do because we have enough?" "Yes," Aaron said. Samuel considered this. "Can I carry the basket next time?" Next time, Aaron said. In 1884, the school grew to the point that Ruth proposed to the school board a third classroom and a third teacher, and she wrote a proposal that was thorough enough to make Howard Finch, who was now accustomed to Ruth's thorough proposals, say it was the most complete document he had seen presented to a school board in his career. The third classroom was approved. The third teacher was a young man named Henry Walsh who came from Kansas City and who was patient and competent, and who fit into the school's routine with minimal adjustment. Ruth turned 32 that year, which she marked quietly, and Aaron was 35. They had been married 5 years and had 2 healthy children and a farm that was genuinely prospering, and a marriage that had weathered ordinary difficulty with the particular durability of something built on materials that do not give. They had their difficult times, as all people do who live closely together. There were weeks when the pressure of the farm and the school and the children and the ordinary weight of responsibility made them both tired and short with each other. There was one winter in 1884 when the wheat prices fell significantly due to an oversupply from the northern plains, that Aaron was grimly quiet for 2 weeks while he recalculated and replanned, and Ruth gave him the space he needed while also being clearly present so that he would not mistake space for abandonment. When he came through the 2 weeks and had a plan that would work, he came to her and said, "I'm sorry I was difficult," and she said, "You weren't difficult, you were worried, there's a difference." And he said, "I love you," which he said regularly and which she never tired of hearing because he meant it the way you can feel when someone means something in the full weight of the words. She said it back. She always said it back because she meant it equally. In the spring of 1885, Ruth found that she was expecting again. She was 33, which she noted to Dr. Drummond with a question about risk, and Felix Drummond, who was now 31 and had been in Caldwell 7 years, and was the most trusted man in town after Aaron, said the risk was not greater than her previous pregnancies, and that she was in excellent health and he had every confidence. She told Aaron on a Sunday afternoon. They were on the porch swing. Clara was 2 and was in the yard under the supervision of Samuel, who was 5 and took the supervision of Clara extremely seriously. The May afternoon was warm and the garden was planted, and the wheat was coming up in the south field, and the swing was moving gently in the spring breeze. He received the news the same way he had received it twice before, still and present and then warm spreading through his face. 3, he said. 3, she said. He looked at Samuel and Clara in the yard. Samuel was explaining something to Clara with elaborate gestures. Clara was sitting in the dirt regarding him with her considering expression. "We built a good life," Aaron said. "We did," Ruth said. "We're still building it," he said. "We are," she said. He put his arm around her on the swing, and she leaned into him and the swing swayed, and the prairie spread out around the farmhouse in the warm May afternoon, green and gold, and enormous and patient. The same prairie that had been here before any of them and would be here after, but which for this particular afternoon, in this particular light, belonged entirely to the people who were living in it. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas, for no reason more specific than that it was a name they both liked and felt right when they said it, arrived in December of 1885, which was a hard month to arrive in, but which Thomas managed with the equanimity he would prove to be characterized by throughout his life. Where Samuel was energetic and curious, and Clara was still and considering, Thomas was easy, in the way of a person who came into the world already reconciled to it. He slept well and ate well, and regarded his older siblings with what appeared to be genuine benign amusement. Samuel, 5 years old, appointed himself Thomas's protector with the same wholehearted intensity he brought to everything. Clara, 2.5, regarded Thomas for a full week with her considering expression, and then decided he was acceptable, which was, for Clara, a warm reception. The school year of 1886 was the largest Ruth had managed. Enrollment was now 48 students across 3 classrooms, and the town's population had grown enough that there were conversations about a second school on the north side of town. Ruth was involved in these conversations at the school board level and also at the practical level of helping to establish the site and the curriculum, and she found the work as engaging as she ever had, more so because the scale of what she was doing had grown. She was also, by 1886, a person of established reputation in Caldwell. She was not a famous person, not the kind of person who appears in newspapers, but she was the kind of person whom everyone in a town knows and trusts, the kind of presence that shapes a community quietly over years, through the accumulation of reliable, careful, consistent work. She had taught, by now, every child in Caldwell under the age of 12. She had been a neighbor and a friend and a presence in the church and the school board and the ongoing conversations about what the town ought to be. She was Ruth Keene now in everyone's speech, though she had kept Harper for professional purposes and signed her teaching documents Ruth Harper Keene, which she thought was correct and which the school board had accepted without difficulty. In the late spring of 1886, Mabel Greer died. She died in May at 61, of a heart that had simply decided it had done enough work, according to Felix Drummond, who was with her at the end. She died at home in her boarding house in her own bed, and she died peacefully, which was exactly what Mabel Greer deserved. Ruth received the news in the morning when Felix came to the school, and she sat down in her chair behind her desk and held the feeling for a long, quiet moment, which was that particular quality of grief that comes when someone who has been a constant, warm presence in your life is suddenly and permanently absent. She had known Mabel for 8 years. Mabel had been the first person in Caldwell who had welcomed her without reservation. Mabel had lent her a blue ribbon for the harvest social and given her tea on the nights when she could not sleep and watched Samuel every day for a year so that Ruth could teach, and had shown up with apple cider and good practical comfort on every occasion that called for it. She went that afternoon and sat in the empty parlor of the boarding house and remembered the first evening she had arrived in Caldwell, tired from the stagecoach and carrying everything she owned, and Mabel had come out onto the porch and taken one of the bags from her without asking and said, "You'll want a bath and a meal in that order," and led her inside. Aaron came and found her there in the evening and sat beside her and held her hand and did not say anything that was not true. They buried Mabel in the church cemetery on a warm May morning with the town around her, and Tom Greer played the fiddle, because Mabel had loved the fiddle. Ruth spoke at the graveside because she had been asked to and because she was glad to, and she said what was true, which was that Mabel Greer had been the kind of person a town is lucky to have, the kind that holds a place together not through authority or wealth, but through consistent human warmth and the willingness to be present when presence is required. The grief settled and did not leave entirely, which is the nature of grief, but which Ruth understood. She had learned to carry loss without letting it hollow her, had learned that from her parents' deaths, and that knowledge did not make the loss smaller but made her better at holding it. Samuel was 6 in the spring of 1886, and Ruth enrolled him in Clara Tims's classroom at the school, which she had discussed at length with Aaron and with Clara herself, who was enthusiastic and who promised to treat Samuel exactly like any other student, which Ruth trusted her to do. Samuel was an engaged and capable student, which was not a surprise, and he already read better than most children his age, which Ruth was careful not to note publicly because she had other children's feelings to consider. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry, and the wheat in Aaron's south field came in short because of the drought, not a disaster but a setback, and Aaron adapted his plans the way he always did, with methodical practicality and without panic. He added a second water source by digging a deeper well on the east side of the property, which he had been considering for 2 years, and which the dry summer made necessary, and he negotiated an arrangement with 2 neighboring farms to share the labor cost of a joint irrigation channel from the creek that ran half a mile north of the property. Ruth helped him with the negotiation letters because her writing was cleaner and more persuasive than his, and he helped her with the practical calculations because his grasp of water flow and channel depth was better than hers. They were good at this, at pooling what they each knew, and had been for 7 years. The irrigation channel was built in the fall of 1886 and functioned as planned, and the two neighboring farms entered into a durable working arrangement, with the Keene farm that involved shared equipment and labor during peak seasons, which benefited everyone and which Aaron had proposed from the beginning, because he understood that a community of farmers who helped each other was more resilient than any individual farm could be alone. 1887 was a good year. The wheat came in strong, the children were healthy, the school continued to grow, and on a warm October evening Aaron and Ruth sat on the porch swing and watched the sunset spread across the Kansas plain in its extraordinary way and counted what they had. "Samuel's reading above his age group," Ruth said. "Clara Timms wants to move him up a year, but I told her to give it one more term." "That's the right call," Aaron said. "Clara, your daughter Clara, has informed me that she has decided she would like a dog." "Clara has informed me of this also," Aaron said. 3 times. Ruth looked at him sideways. "What did you say?" "I said we'd see," he said. "Which with Clara buys perhaps 2 more weeks before I'm required to have an actual answer." "We could get a dog," Ruth said. "We could," he said. "The children would love it," she said. "The children, the dog, or both," he said. "All 3, she said. He was quiet for a moment in his thinking way. "A cattle dog might be useful," he said, "if we were getting a dog anyway." "Then we're getting a dog," she said. He looked at her with that warm expression. "Just like that." "Clara is going to ask again in 2 weeks," Ruth said. "And you'll say yes because you can't say no to her, Aaron. She has your eyes." He laughed, the real laugh that she loved, which came from the center of him. "She does have my eyes," he said. The dog was a blue heeler they named Ranger, and he arrived in November of 1887, and Clara announced him to the household with the proprietorial satisfaction of a 2.5-year-old who has successfully negotiated a demand. Samuel was immediately devoted. Thomas, not yet 2, regarded Ranger with the same benign interest he brought to most things. Ranger proved to be exactly what Aaron had hoped, intelligent and useful with the chickens, and eventually with the cattle Aaron added to the farm in 1888. The cattle came because the market had shifted. The old cattle drives north through Caldwell were largely over by the late 1880s, the railroad having changed the routes, and the land that had been cattle drive country was becoming farming and ranching country. And Aaron had the acreage and the water access and the grass to support a small herd, and it made the farm more diversified and therefore more stable. Ruth watched him manage the cattle with the same attention she had watched him do everything over the 9 years she had known him. He was good with animals in the way of a person who understands that animals respond to how they are treated and who treats them accordingly. Ranger helped and was excellent at the work, and the children had been given enough instruction about the cattle that they understood how to behave around them, which was another of Aaron's patient, methodical projects. Samuel turned 8 in 1888. Clara turned 5. Thomas turned 2 in December. The house had been added to twice, 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen with a larger stove, and the farm was in the best condition it had ever been. The porch had been enclosed, and the porch swing was inside the enclosure now, sheltered from the worst weather, a permanent feature of the farmhouse in the way that certain objects become part of a family's life, so deeply they seem to have always been there. Ruth's hair had a few threads of gray at the temples by 1888, which she noticed, and which Aaron called beautiful with the matter-of-fact sincerity that was one of the things about him she was most grateful for, that he said true things plainly and without performance. She was 36. He was 39. They had been married 9 years and had built together something that neither of them could have built alone, which was the whole point. One evening in the summer of 1888, She came out to the porch swing in the late afternoon and found Aaron already there, which was not unusual. But he was sitting differently than usual, without the forward-leaning attentiveness he normally had, more settled, the way a man sits when he has arrived somewhere. She sat beside him, and the swing took on their combined weight, and they both looked out at the prairie, which was golden in the summer light, the way it gets in August when the wheat has been cut and the stubble stands in the low sun. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "About how far things have come," he said. She knew what he meant. She leaned her shoulder against his. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time I sat on this swing? September 1878, he said without hesitation. She smiled. "You said you weren't entirely sure who you'd built it for." "I was lying a little," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "Were you?" "I had an idea," he said. "I had a feeling. I didn't know your name yet. But I had built the swing, and I was waiting. In the way you wait for something you're not sure will come but you're pretty sure will, and I wanted to have the swing ready." She looked at him for a long moment in the summer light. "How did you know?" she said. "I didn't know," he said. "I just believed." She took his hand. The swing moved. Somewhere in the house, Samuel and Clara were in the middle of an argument about something that would require adult involvement within the next 5 minutes, and Thomas was making the sounds of a child constructively occupied that parents learn to identify. The cattle were visible in the south field, moving slowly in the early evening. The red barn stood solid against the sky. The garden was full. The wheat was in. "Aaron," she said. "Ruth," he said. "I am very glad I stopped at the fence," she said. He raised her hand and kissed the back of it, which was something he had started doing early in their courtship and had not stopped doing in 9 years of marriage, and which she still felt in the full warm length of her. "So am I," he said. The argument in the house reached the level that required intervention, and they both stood together and went inside, and the porch swing settled into stillness behind them, and then, caught by a breath of the August breeze, resumed its slow, patient movement, back and forth in the warm evening. The years after 1888 continued to build the way good things build, not dramatically but steadily, and with the kind of interest that compounds. Aaron expanded the cattle operation carefully, not overreaching, keeping the herd at a size the land could sustain. Ruth's school consolidated and grew in quality, if not always in enrollment, as Caldwell's growth stabilized in the 1890s into the settled pattern of a permanent town rather than a frontier outpost. Samuel moved through his school years with distinction, and had his father's head for practical things and his mother's head for language and history, which made him interested in law, which interested Ruth greatly, and which Aaron said made complete sense. Clara Keene grew into the person her early stillness had suggested, thoughtful and deliberate, and with a precision of mind that reminded Ruth of the best students she had ever taught. She was also capable of great warmth once she had decided someone was worth it, which was a quality she shared with her father. Thomas was, as he had always been, easy in the world, good-natured and capable, and possessed of a social ease that came naturally to some people and cannot be taught, and which made him friends easily wherever he went. The decade of the 1890s brought some of the same difficulties it brought to everyone on the Kansas plains. The drought of 1893 was bad, and the economic depression of those years was real and felt. Aaron and Ruth managed through it the way they managed through everything, together and practically, and without panic. The irrigation channel proved its value. The diversified farm, cattle and wheat and chickens and garden, was more stable than a single crop operation would have been. They ate from the garden and sold what they could and got through the hard years in the way of people who have been building for the long term. In 1895, Samuel, 15, told his parents he intended to read law. He had found, through Ruth's school library, a copy of Blackstone's commentaries that she had ordered years ago for her own reading, and he had worked through it with the focused intensity of someone who has found the thing they are made for. Aaron listened to this plan with his full attention, and then asked 3 practical questions about how Samuel intended to pursue it, and when Samuel answered them thoroughly, Aaron nodded and said, "Then let's figure out how." It required planning and saving, and eventually, a correspondence with a law office in Wichita that would take Samuel as a reader. But it was figured out, because Aaron and Ruth had learned over 17 years of marriage that most things can be figured out if you approach them methodically and without fear. Clara, at 12, had announced a plan of her own, which was to teach, which surprised no one. Ruth was careful not to show how deeply pleased she was by this, because Clara's plan should be Clara's own. She managed to maintain her expression of neutral parental support for approximately 2 days before Clara said, "Mother, you can just be happy about it," which made Ruth laugh and admit the happiness. Thomas, at 9, had not yet announced a plan, but he had befriended every child in Caldwell across every family and social boundary with his natural warmth, and Aaron suspected privately that Thomas would end up doing something that involved working with people, though what exactly remained to be seen. Ranger lived to the good age of 12 years and died in the spring of 1899, which grieved the family genuinely. He was buried under the cottonwood tree at the east side of the property, with a marker that Thomas had carved carefully with Ranger, a good dog, which was entirely true and entirely sufficient. Clara, who was 16, had cried quietly for a day. Samuel, who was 19 and reading law in Wichita, wrote home a letter of condolence that was so unexpectedly moving in its precision that Ruth read it twice and kept it. Thomas, who was 13, had taken it hard but practically and had asked, after a week, if they could get another cattle dog, and a second blue heeler arrived that summer, named Scout, who was excellent. The year 1900 came, and with it, the feeling of a turning, not just of the calendar but of something larger, a sense that the century in which Aaron and Ruth had been young and had come to Kansas, and had built their 40 acres into something worth looking at was ending, and something new was beginning. They were both over 50 now, or close to it, Aaron at 51 and Ruth at 48, and the world around Caldwell had changed enormously from the cattle drive days of 1878. The frontier was officially closed, the newspapers said, the West was settled, the old wildness was behind them. Ruth sat on the porch swing on the first evening of 1900 and thought about this. The prairie was dark and cold, and the stars were the same stars that had always been there. The farmhouse was warm behind her, and inside Aaron was putting the last of the children to bed, Thomas still being young enough to require the ritual even if he considered himself past it, and Clara had fallen asleep over a book, and Samuel was away in Wichita but would be home in the spring. 22 years she had been in Caldwell, 21 years married to Aaron Keene. She had arrived with one trunk and one carpetbag, and a letter of employment and a particular quality of courage, and she had built a life that was complete in all the ways that mattered, not without grief, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary and extraordinary weight of being a person in the world, but complete, whole, genuinely and sustainably good. Aaron came out and sat beside her on the swing. He had gotten broader through the middle, and his hair was fully silver now, which suited him, and his hands were as strong as they had ever been. He brought her a cup of tea and one for himself, and they sat in the cold January dark looking out at the prairie. "New century," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you worried about it?" he asked. "No," she said. "Are you?" "No," he said. "I think it'll be much like the last one, difficult in places and good in others and worth the effort overall," she smiled. "That's your philosophy of everything." "It served pretty well," he said. She leaned her head on his shoulder the way she had been doing for 21 years, and the swing moved, and the stars were out over the Kansas plain in their extraordinary abundance, and she thought about the woman who had stopped at the fence in September of 1878 and looked up the rise at the empty porch swing and asked who it was for. She had become the answer to that question. She had become the person the swing had been built for, before Aaron knew her name or her face, before she had ever heard of Caldwell or seen the Kansas sky or known that courage could bring you to a place where you would be exactly where you needed to be. In the spring of 1901, Samuel came home from Wichita as a qualified attorney, 21 years old, and was met on the porch by his whole family, by his father who shook his hand and held it for a long time, by his mother who held his face in both hands and looked at him with the expression that parents have when they see their child become what they were capable of being, by Clara at 18 who said, "It's about time," which was affectionate in the way Clara's observations were. Precisely deployed, and by Thomas at 15, who was genuinely thrilled and made it obvious. Samuel set up a law practice in Caldwell, in a small office on the main street 2 blocks from the general store where Aaron and Ruth had met 23 years before. He was good at it from the beginning, which was not a surprise to either of his parents. Clara went east to Kansas City to study education formally in 1902, which she had been planning for 2 years, and which the family had saved toward with the same methodical purpose Aaron brought to everything worth building toward. She was gone for 2 years and wrote letters every week with the precision and warmth that was entirely her own. And she came back to Caldwell in 1904, a qualified teacher, 21 years old, and took up a position in the school that her mother had built. Ruth, by 1904, was 52 and in her 26th year in Caldwell, and she was still teaching, still in the schoolroom 5 days a week, still finding the work as sustaining as she ever had, though she had begun to think about what would come after, not soon but eventually. Having Clara in the school beside her was one of the great pleasures of her life, both the professional pleasure of working with someone she entirely trusted and the personal pleasure of being in the same room as her daughter every day. Thomas, at 18 in 1903, had gone to work with a civil engineer who was building the new water infrastructure for Caldwell's expanded population. He had Aaron's head for practical systems and his own natural ease with the people around him, and the engineer had recognized almost immediately that Thomas was capable, and by 1905, at 20, he was a valued member of the firm and beginning to think about his own projects. Aaron at 56 managed the farm with the same methodology, but delegated more of the physical work now, employing 2 farmhands who had worked with him long enough to know the place as well as he did. He was healthy and strong and in full possession of himself, but he was also honest about what 40 acres required and what wisdom said about matching effort to capacity. He had begun to write a detailed farm journal, not just records but observations, about the land and the weather and what he had learned over more than 20 years of working this particular ground, and Ruth read portions of it and thought it was remarkable, specific and practical and true in a way that only comes from long attention. She told him he should share it, that other farmers in the area could benefit from what he had learned. He considered this with his usual thoughtfulness and eventually agreed, and portions of his farm journal were shared through the County Agricultural Association and were received with the appreciation that accumulated practical knowledge receives from people who recognize it. In 1906, Samuel Keene married a woman named Margaret Hollies, a schoolteacher from Wellington who was 24 years old and intelligent and kind, and Ruth liked her enormously on their first meeting, which did not always happen and which she trusted. The wedding was held in Caldwell's church, and the whole town came, as the whole town had come to Ruth and Aaron's wedding in 1879, because Samuel Keene was as known in Caldwell as his parents, and because people in small towns go to weddings the way they mark everything, communally and with celebration. Ruth sat beside Aaron in the church pew and held his hand and watched their son stand at the altar, and felt the particular layered happiness of a parent watching their child begin what they had begun, the building of a life with someone chosen deliberately and with full attention. Aaron leaned down and said quietly in her ear, "Reminds me of a day I'm partial to." She squeezed his hand. "Me too," she whispered. The year 1907 brought the first grandchild. Samuel and Margaret had a boy they named John, which was Margaret's father's name, and Ruth and Aaron received the news of John's birth with a warmth that was different from but connected to the warmth of their own children's births, wider and somehow more spacious, as though happiness at this scale required more room. Ruth held John for the first time in Samuel's house in Caldwell, and looked at the small face of her grandson, and felt the full extraordinary weight of time, of 29 years on the Kansas plain, of everything built from that single September morning in 1878. Aaron stood beside her and looked at John also and then at Ruth, and his expression was the one she had been reading for 28 years, the one that said, "All of this matters completely." "Hello, John," Ruth said to the baby. "Welcome." That evening, Aaron and Ruth sat on the porch swing in the summer dark, and the prairie was around them in the big, warm Kansas night, and the stars were out, and somewhere in the house, the lamp was lit, and everything that had been built was fully real. The farm and the house and the children and now a grandchild, all of it present and alive. "Do you remember," Aaron said, in the comfortable way they had of returning to the beginning, "why you stopped at the fence?" "I was walking," she said, "and the swing was empty and it was beautiful, and I thought, who is that for? And you asked me," he said, "and you said you weren't entirely sure," she said. "And I smiled," he said. She turned her head and looked at him in the lamplight that fell from the house window across the porch. 55 years old and 30 years in Caldwell and 28 years of mornings, and blizzards and gardens and children and grief and grace. And this man beside her who had built the swing before he had anyone to sit on it because he believed in what was coming. "What were you thinking," she said, "when you smiled?" He looked at her for a moment with those eyes that were still at 60, the color of creek water on a cloudy afternoon, not quite gray, not quite green, something in between. "I was thinking," he said, "that I had built it for the right reason, that whoever came to sit on it would be exactly right, and that they were probably already on their way." She looked at him. "I was already on my way," she said. "You were," he said. She leaned against him, and the swing moved in the warm summer dark, and the prairie breathed around them, and the farmhouse held all its warmth and life, and everything that had been built from 40 empty acres and one porch swing, and two people who believed in the possible was standing steady and complete in the Kansas night. And the swing moved, back and forth, gently, as it had always moved, as it would move for years to come, the first thing Aaron Keene had built for someone who had not arrived yet. And the thing she had come to, without knowing she was coming, across the whole long distance of her life. The stars were out in their great abundance over the plain, the same stars, the same Kansas sky, the same swing swaying in the warm dark, and the two of them on it together, exactly where they had been building toward from the very beginning.